Hello! Hello, hello, hello! Aloha! Aloha! My name is Stuart K. Hayashi, and I want to talk with you about open immigration and what it means. Now, people often assume I'm right wing. I live in Hawaii, everyone in Hawaii is a Democrat, and I'm not a Democrat. Therefore, lots of people in Hawaii, with whom I come into contact regularly, think of me as a right wing guy. But there's one area where I frequently butt heads with conservatives, people on the right, with Republicans, and that is on the issue of immigration, especially when it has to do with immigration from Mexico, when people cross the U.S.-Mexican border without getting a visa first. Now, you might ask, why should someone in Hawaii care about that? Well, Hawaii has immigration issues too. I think a lot of people in Hawaii are scared of Filipino immigrants. And a lot of the complaints that you hear from Californians and Arizonans about Mexicans coming to the USA without a visa, occasionally you'll hear those complaints about Filipino immigrants in Hawaii. You know, um, Philippines is one of the poorer countries in the world today, and many people from the Philippines come to Hawaii searching for a better life. They want to make a better life for themselves, but often many people who come from the Philippines are unskilled, and so they take on these unskilled jobs, often for low pay. You see, and people are worried that, if a lot of Filipinos come to Hawaii and take these jobs, they're going to bid down wages, steal their jobs, things like that. And of course, Hawaii has a big Chinatown, and there's concerns over how many of these people in Chinatown come to Hawaii without getting a visa first. So even though I'm not on anywhere near the U.S.-Mexican border, we in Hawaii do face issues pertaining to undocumented immigration. But of course, right now in the USA today, people are particularly worried about immigrants from Mexico, from South America, and now from the Middle East. There are issues pertaining to the Syrian refugees, to people from North Africa, countries that are mostly Muslim. Now, the arguments between Democrats and Republicans about immigrants are quite familiar, so I want to address another aspect of it. As a free marketer, I find myself rather disturbed and worried. And to my consternation, I even hear people who call themselves libertarians and objectivists succumbing to this anti-immigration fervor. So I want to address arguments that are often presented as sort of, quote, libertarian or objectivist arguments against the principle of open immigration, of laissez-faire immigration policy. And such an argument often goes like this. If we had a complete free market, which in my opinion is it's a constitutional liberal republic, we had a constitutional liberal republican government, without a welfare state, then yeah, we can tolerate an open immigration policy. But the fact of the matter is, we do have a big welfare state. And when all these immigrants come over from these poor countries, they come to USA, and, well, tax money gets spent on them. They go on welfare, and even if they don't get these official, welfare programs like temporary assistance for needy families, they still use roads funded by taxpayers. They send their kids to government schools, and then another worry is that, oh, if my kids are in school with these uh, kids from these Hispanic kids, born to illegal immigrants, they're going to try to have bilingual education. The government schools are going to insist on teaching kids in both English and Spanish, and that really creates a lot of inconveniences for teaching my kids. Why do my kids have to learn Spanish? So basically, the issue is this: it's claimed that if we had a liberal Republican night watchman state, if we had a free market without a welfare state, then yes, open immigration would be okay. But as long as we do have a welfare state, open immigration is not okay. There has to be border controls, there has to be government regulation, there has to be ways of restricting immigration, there has to be government crackdowns on people who come to the United States without governmental permission first. Even Milton Friedman in his final years said this. So basically what they say is, as long as we have a welfare state, then I will support restrictions on immigration. Which what they really mean is, when do they want an open immigration policy? Not in my lifetime. So here I will present my rebuttal. My argument is that even if there is a welfare state, even if we cannot get rid of the welfare state in our own lifetimes, the principled free marketer position, the free principled capitalist position is still to favor open immigration and to stand against those who would deport people who enter the United States without getting a permission slip first. This video is my attempt to explain that. First, we have to talk about licensing, because that's what the visa system largely comes down to. Now, we free marketers are very familiar with arguments about governmental licensing and why that's inappropriate. Basically, if we have laws saying you have to have a license to do something first, that restricts that activity, especially if it comes to a trade. For example, you have to have a license to practice law first. You need to be part of the American Bar Association. You need to have a license to be a doctor. You even need a license to be a plumber or a hairdresser. And Democrats and Republicans think, well, that makes sense. But we free marketers, especially those of us who call ourselves libertarians or objectivists, we don't agree. Milton Friedman, who was not for open immigration in his final years, pointed out the problems with licensing. If it's the case where you have to have a license to become a plumber, that restricts the number of plumbers, therefore that restricts competition among in the plumbing industry, and therefore every time we have to hire a plumber, we have to pay more money than probably otherwise we'd have to pay. And of course, there's business licenses. You need a license to open any kind of business at all. Likewise, if you want to enter the United States, you need a license called a visa, and there are several different types. However, even though there are licenses for businesses and licenses for immigration, licensing for immigration is stricter for a special reason. Even though there are licensing rules that limit the number of practicing doctors, the number of practicing plumbers, there is not a quota that places a cap on the number of business licenses issued every year. There is no cap. There is no quota saying you can't have more than 100 new farms open each year. And yet, there are quotas on the number of people who can enter the USA legally each year. And I have to qualify that. I have to explain that. For many decades, we had a quota system limiting the number of people that come in legally, and it was an explicit quota. The quota was the word used. Since 1965, we've done away with that word. We still use the word quota, but we still have in practice a quota system that places that cap on the number of people that come in legally. So this is my explanation. Now, since starting in 1790, from 1790 all the way to the 1870s, we largely didn't have some stringent federal system that limiting immigration. Immigration controls largely started off in the 1870s in response to pressure from labor unions. Basically, what happened was they were building the transcontinental railroads, the Central Pacific and Union Pacific, The people on the Union Pacific were on the eastern side of the United States. They hired these Irish immigrant workers. On the west coast, with the Central Pacific, with people like me and Stanford, they hired low Chinese immigrants for low wages. And of course, labor unions objected. They said, "Who are these Chinese people who come in? Who are these Chinamen to come in and take all our jobs for low pay?" So, bowing to pressure from these labor unions, the federal government instituted the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1875 to bar Chinese immigrants. And that is actually around in the late 19th century. That was when people finally started entering the United States illegally from the U.S.-Mexican border. But those people were not Mexican. They were Chinese. After the Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinese immigrants tried to sneak into the USA from the U.S.-Canadian border, and there was a crackdown on them. Because of the crackdown, they decided to try the U.S.-Mexican border. At the time, people could still freely, for the most part freely, travel between the USA and Mexico. Lots of Mexicans came into the border states just fine. And I don't think there was governmental crackdown trying to stop them. Of course, in the late 19th century is when the eugenics movement started, and that's often conflated with social Darwinism. So there was a eugenics movement, there was a scientific racism movement, but there was no free market social Darwinism movement. And Richard Hofstadter, in his 1940s book, Social Darwinism and American Thought, tried to conflate the free market evolutionism of Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner with the eugenics movement. And I refute that in this book, Hunting Down Social Darwinism. But that's another issue for another day. But anyway, the eugenics movement was openly racist, didn't like the idea of non-whites coming to the USA and having children with whites. So they lobbied for immigration restriction, and they got it. And those restrictions became very popular in the 1920s. There are many ways I think Calvin Coolidge was a better president than his successors, better than most presidents who came after him. But Calvin Coolidge succumbed to the eugenics craze and to immigration restriction. So by his time, there were many federal laws putting immigration restriction in place for openly racist reasons, and throughout those decades, that's when there was a national quota system, national origin quota system of immigration, where they said, okay, when it comes to each country, there's quota that puts a cap on the number of people allowed to come in from each country every year. So maybe X number of people are allowed to come to the USA from France, X number of people are allowed to come in from Spain, X number of people are allowed to come in from Japan. And I think very people would dispute that the national origin system was openly racist. The idea was, what they said was, we want more people from France because they're ethnically similar to us, but people from the Yugoslavian region, not so much. They're a bit more different from us. Therefore, we're going to allow fewer number of people from Yugoslavia in, and still fewer from Japan because they're even less similar to us. And so in 1965, they said, let's change that. In 1965 is when we saw the birth of the Immigration and Nationality Act, also called the Hart-Celler Act. I apologize if I mispronounce Celler. It's spelled C-E-L-L-E-R, so I'm saying Celler. And actually, this law was supposed to be a remedy to the open racism of the past national origin quotas. So that I'm glad that they were trying to address the racism and get rid of that, but it had some other consequences that I think they didn't anticipate. So this law was passed by Congress and signed by President Lyndon Johnson, and there's a big issue with it that created the modern problem with illegal immigration. This is the regime we're currently under. Okay, so now what they said is we're going to have visas, and a visa is a license saying you as a foreigner are allowed to come into the United States for a specified duration. We have student visas saying you can come to seek university education in the USA for a limited amount of time. There are worker visas where you're allowed to come to the USA to work at a US firm for a specified amount of time. And there are family visas. The idea is that you have family members already in the USA, therefore, and they can vouch for you, and therefore, if you already have family members in the USA, you can come to the USA for a limited amount of time. And there are also green cards. A green card lets you be a permanent resident alien. If you have a green card, it means you're not a U.S. citizen yet. You're not yet a naturalized U.S. citizen. You're still recognized as a foreigner, as an alien, but you are now recognized as a permanent resident. So if you get a green card, you can't be deported anymore. You're no longer an illegal alien. You're a legal alien. And the reason why this creates an issue with regard to Mexico and South America is this. Under those rules, since 1965 on into the present, rules are that out of all the visas approved, out of all the visa applications approved each year, no more than 7% of them can be for people from the same country. For example, let's say, for example, of all the visas approved, no more than 7% of them this year can be for Mexicans from Mexico. Well, what if all the visa applications we get each year? What of all the visa applications the USA gets each year, 8% of them are from Mexicans. Well, you see that 1 percentage point of Mexicans, too bad, no visa application approval. And the problem is that even though out of all visa applications approved each year, no more than 7% can be from Mexico. Out of all visa applications submitted each year, 30% of them are from Mexico. So, out of all people applying for visas to come to the USA, a disproportionately large percentage of them are from Mexico. And that makes sense. I mean, they're at the border. They're adjacent to the United States. They're directly south of contiguous states. So of course, they're going to be the ones who are most interested in coming to the USA. If we're talking about people all the way from India or Japan or China, and they want to come to the USA, they have to travel across the entire ocean. Of course, a disproportionately large percentage of people trying to come to the USA will be from Mexico. And also there's issue. And Canada is also adjacent to the USA. There's also the issue of poverty. And I want to address that too. So basically, yes. So the problem with Mexico and many other South American countries is that their governments are kleptocracies. They are not constitutional liberal republics. They are a form of government called kleptocracy. What this means is that their government doesn't have consistent rule of law. It's often very corrupt. It's a case where usually if you want police to protect you, you have to bribe them first. In fact, more often, you need protection from the police. Often the government has arbitrary power to confiscate your private property whenever it wants to, and you have no recourse. You can confiscate your farmland arbitrarily. And usually a kleptocracy is ruled by a big strong man. I mean, that's the case in Russia under Vladimir Putin. That's Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe. Many African countries, I think Congo, are in kleptocratic governments. You could say, a lot of people say Somalia is anarchist. I would say it's actually a kleptocracy ruled by different gangs of kleptocrats, each trying to gain more power over the other, so they can have a unified Somalia under a single kleptocracy. And Mexico falls into that category. Now, I don't want to create a false impression that because there actually has been some progress in Mexico over the past 40 years. I think there are people in Mexico who are trying to liberalize the government, trying to make it more of a due process system with more rule of law. I think there are people in Mexico who are like that. And I think to some extent, Vicente Fox, when he was vice president, was trying that. And I think that's also happening in the Philippines. That many decades ago, the Philippines was ruled by Ferdinand Marcos, who was a kleptocratic dictator. And I think since then, there has been improvement in the Philippines. They're trying to liberalize. But for the most part, even though they're trying, so there has been some progress, but I think for the most part, you can see that they haven't succeeded. They're not, the Philippines and Mexico are not as constitutionally liberal republican as, say, the USA or Canada or the United Kingdom or Japan. For the most part, I would say they're still kleptocracies. They still don't have sufficient rule of law. People's private property are not protected by the government instead, unless you have connections. More often, your private property is vulnerable to being expropriated by the state and cronies of the state. So, that's what the cause of poverty in all these countries. If you know that the fruit of your labor is not going to be protected from thieves, what guarantee do you have that, what guarantee do you have that your fortune will be safe? What incentive do you have to build up your fortune? People in these poor countries do have farms, they do labor, they do build wealth, but this wealth is extra legal. It's informal. The amount of wealth you have is informal. It's hard to go to the bank and have your wealth protected. It's hard to have banks certify that you do have this wealth, and therefore it's harder to get more investment. So that's why. So it's not a case of people in Mexico or the Philippines being lazy or anything like that. Far from it. And this whole notion that sometimes I hear that this notion that free marketers say, oh, if people are poor in poor countries, it means they're lazy. That's a straw man. Free marketers don't think countries are poor because people in them are lazy. How many free market economists do you actually hear saying that? No, the issue is that these countries are poor because they remain kleptocracies, which make it difficult for people to build up wealth, which make it difficult to get foreign direct investment. Make it difficult to and when people are expropriated in these countries, and when entrepreneurs are expropriated, they don't have much recourse. So that's why lots of people want to move from Mexico to the USA, and they don't have the opportunity. And because of our present system, which is an implicit de facto quota system that we have in place now, the waiting period is very long. The Carnegie Institution did a study on this. It says that if you apply for a family visa, it takes you an average. It takes a Mexican an average 5 to 7 years to get their family visa approved, if they're lucky. And in fact, the backlog of visa applications is so bad. Here's a thought experiment from an essay I read on Medium.com. If the immigration office received no new visa applications at all, none new coming in at all, it would still take at least 19 years for them to clear their entire backlog. And if you want a green card, it's especially troubling. So Philip Legrain did a study on this, and he wrote about this for Forbes magazine. There's an article he wrote called Let Them In. It was published on June 10th, 2010, and he got this information from the State Department. If you made an average the number of years it took for different people from different countries to get green cards. Uh, it would take on average, if you're Mexican, it would take you an average 131 years to get your green card, to become a legal, permanent resident alien. Do you want to wait 131 years for your green card? Should you even wait 5 to 7 years to get your visa? I mean, uh, so I try to imagine myself in their position where I'm in Mexico or some other uh, less developed third world kleptocracy. You're impoverished, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that the government um, discourages the creation of wealth rather than encourages it because it doesn't protect your property. It just takes your property. The murder rate is high because police won't protect you. You need protection from the police. Murder rate's high. The child mortality rate's high. There's lots of starvation. And if you want to get to the USA legally, you have to wait an average 5 to 7 years. When you're starving, well, by definition, when you're starving, you don't have time. When you're starving, you are at risk of starving to death. You have to think about how you're going to get by in the next few months. So no, if I'm in that position, if I'm poor and starving in a kleptocracy where there's a high murder rate and I can be the next one murdered, I am not going to wait 5 to 7 years to get anyone's permission to go to some place that's freer, where I have a greater chance of survival, where I have a greater chance of building up a fortune for myself and taking care of my family. I am going to make that illegal trek. And that's why I came to conflict with a lot of conservatives and Republicans on this issue. A lot of them say, well, get in line. If you want to come, hey, if you want to come to the USA, great. But hey, you have to do it legal like everyone else. So get in line. A line that would take 19 years to clear. It's not realistic at all. No, if people are poor and starving in a kleptocracy, I don't think they should wait 5 to 7 years in the line to get someone's permission not to die. So I want to bring up a parallel situation that maybe might be more amenable to conservatives and libertarians and my fellow objectivists. Okay, I think maybe libertarians and objectivists can relate to this a bit more. So John Stossel talked about problems with socialized medicine in countries like Canada and the United Kingdom. Because of socialized medicine creates this huge bureaucracy, and there's so many problems with it. I mean, first, in the Institute of Socialized Medicine, if everyone can get medical care free, then you can expect a lot of people are going to go to the doctor for any little thing. So that's what happened with many countries when they first instituted socialized medicine. They said, hey, we have to find a way to get our costs down. We have to find a way to preserve the system. So that's how they came up with rationing. So they said, okay, we're going to keep our costs down when it comes to expenditures on healthcare, but we do that by restricting the quantity of service that's made available to people. So now there's only a limited quantity of dental services you can get under socialized that will be dispersed under socialized medicine each year in all these countries. For when it comes to heart surgery, liver transplants, things like that. There's all of those operations are rationed. And of course, what's happened is that now they have a backlog. So there are many cases where people under socialized medicine need immediate care. They need a heart surgery right away. They need liver surgery right away. Probably it has to be done in the next few months, the next few weeks maybe. And yet they have to wait, say, 8 months or even a year to get an appointment. And they have their own huge backlog. So what happens is, in many cases, a lot of people under socialized medicine, this is according to reports, You know, I'm actually I live in Europe, so maybe Europeans will dispute me on this, but I don't live in Canada either. But what I've read is I've read reports of people who need urgent care, and you know, saying I can't wait this long to get my operation. I have to live. I want to live, not die. And these people resort to the black market. You know, some people I've read reports of people in Canada trying to find middlemen, agents who will help them get medical care they need outside of Canada. In 2009, John Stossel said that there were even cases of people opening black market clinics, doctors opening black market clinics in Canada, and even practicing very openly. We have these illegal black market clinics in Canada. They're practicing quite openly in front of police, and because police are sympathetic to the plight of people who need health care, police look the other way. That was in a John Stossel report. If I perhaps I'm mistaken about interpreting this. Perhaps people from Canada might say that's not the case currently. But if that's what's going on, I think a lot of libertarians and objectivists can relate to that. I think we can say, yeah, if the choice is breaking the law peacefully or death, I choose breaking the law peacefully. These laws are unjust and they do not deserve to exist. And who is the government to get in my way of getting quality health care? If I seek out a black market vendor, black market doctor, I'm not infringing on anyone else's rights. I'm not doing violence to them. I'm not initiating the use of force on them or their private property. So who are they to stop me from using the black market to get quality health care or even low quality health care? Even if I seek out black market and risking low quality health care, why is that the business of any third parties? Shouldn't that be up to me? So yeah, so when it comes to these people resorting to the black market to get quality health care because of socialist bureaucracy, you know, obstructing them from getting health care and making them wait, I don't hear about libertarians or objectivists or conservatives or Republicans complaining about that. If someone in Canada resorts to using the black market to get health care, to get a much needed operation, a much needed appointment, because he or she can't wait that long, I don't hear conservatives or Republicans saying, hey, wait your turn, get in line. I'm for, get in your line like everyone else. Who are you to pop ahead of the line? That's so unfair. I'm for legal medical care, not illegal medical care, which is what you're getting. Well, get in line and wait like everyone else. That's what's fair. I don't hear that. But if it's morally okay for people to seek out healthcare peacefully, even if they don't have the government's permission, then why is it so horrible that for a Mexican to cross the border into the USA and stay on a private plot of land on a U.S. citizen who consents to a Mexican staying on his private plot of land? Why is that so objectionable? Why should we object? Why does anyone doing that require permission from the government in the form of a visa? Of course, the rebuttal here is when Mexicans come to the USA and stay on the land of U.S. citizens who consent to. Okay, well, I'll put it this way. Let's say I'm a U.S. citizen. I own my own plot of land in the USA, my own private plot, and I let Mexicans stay on that private plot. Maybe I'm Californian or in Arizona, Colorado, and I let Mexicans stay on my private plot. I let them lodge there. I consent to them lodging there. And I do this knowing full well that those people came to the USA without getting a visa first. But how does that initiate use of force on anyone else? How does it obstruct your private property rights? why should any third party come in and say the government should send armed men to detain those Mexicans and deport them and send them across the border by force? Why is it anyone's business? Now, of course, the normal rebuttal is, but when those Mexicans are staying on your land, Stuart, they are encroaching on our rights because they are part of the welfare system, because they contribute to the fact that tax money is expropriated from me. The argument goes like this. They often say when these Mexicans come to the USA without visas, they go on welfare. They get programs like temporary assistance to needy families. They go to hospitals and get taxpayer-funded health care. Now, see, temporary assistance for needy families is normally this program that people talk about. That's what they normally have in mind when they talk about welfare. But people will say, well, even if we don't talk about what's official welfare, there are other tax expenditures we have to keep in mind. These Mexicans are going to use the road, and we have to pay for that in taxes. And the Mexicans are going to send their kids to government schools, and we're going to pay for that in taxes. And so, just by the fact that these people are recipients of this tax money, they are initiating use of force on us. They are encroaching on us. So, I'm going to rebut that. I think that argument fails to distinguish who's really the party that is violating your rights. It's the politicians doing that. It's politicians who vote to take your money, who say we should take the money from some people and give it to anyone else. And really, it doesn't matter to me whether the recipients are born in the USA or born out of the USA. To me, it doesn't matter. If the government is pointing a gun at me and demanding my money, I resent it no matter what. Regardless of whether the money is going to be given to a native-born U.S. citizen or a foreigner, it doesn't matter to me either, or whether the money is given to U.S. citizens or foreigners or corporations or farmers or museums. It really doesn't matter to me. What I resent is the fact that someone's pointing a gun at me and taking my money for any reason at all. So, if you resent the fact that there are people getting welfare, we should look at who's responsible for that. It's politicians who say the government is right to take money from some people and give it to others. It's the people who are aiming guns at you, and taking your money. They're the ones who are robbing from you, not the people who are on the receiving end. And as I said in the previous video, we could say that in our welfare state, to a large extent, everyone's on the receiving end in some form of taxpayer subsidies. You could say I'm on welfare every time I drive on a road financed through tax money. You could say I'm on welfare every time I go to the city library because taxes pay for its maintenance and upkeep. Of course, then the argument is, yes, it's true. In a welfare state, everyone's part of the tax burden. But why should we add to it? The more immigrants come in, the greater the burden becomes. But there's still a problem with that argument too, because notice how it doesn't take into account the fact that there's another way that our population increases. There's another way the so-called welfare burden increases, and that is native-born U.S. citizens giving birth to other native-born U.S. citizens. So even if there was no immigration at all, even if we somehow managed to block all immigrants from entering the USA, our population would still grow. I mean, even if no one came in or out of the country, our population would still grow. We would still have net growth in our population as long as people choose to have kids, especially if two parent family chooses to have more than 2 kids, then I think those native-born U.S. citizens are probably going to send their kids to government schools funded by tax money. I think they're going to use the roads, and so a lot of these arguments about how the immigrants supposedly add to our current burdens and our current tax burdens could also be applied to people in poor neighborhoods giving birth to other native-born U.S. citizens, and I'll get back to that one. But you see, the thing is that I don't approve of the welfare state. I don't think the government should take money from some people and give it to others by force. And really, it makes no difference to me whether the recipient is native-born or a foreigner. It doesn't matter to me whether that person is native-born or a foreigner. There shouldn't be any initiations of the use of force at all on the part of the government. Period. So I don't like this favoritism on the part of many people who claim to support the free market when they pick on immigrants. And you can see this in a lot of political parties in Europe, the so-called conservative parties in Western Europe, like in places like Norway and Germany and the United Kingdom. And this is what they say. They often say, "Yeah, I'm for the free market, and that's why we have to have immigration control, because immigrants come in and they come on welfare, and their tax money is spent on them." And no, that welfare money should be spent on us first. Welfare, if money is going to be spent for welfare services, they should be spent on native-born citizens first. That's what they say, and to me, if people say that, then they're disingenuous in claiming to support free enterprise. Right there, they are conceding that there are cases where welfare is good. There are cases where it's good for the state to take money from some people by force and give it to others. And the New York Times called it welfare chauvinism. The idea is that, immigrants are bad. We should preserve the welfare. Immigrants are bad because they're going to come here and bankrupt the welfare state. And no, the welfare money should be here for our native-born people first. The New York Times calls it welfare chauvinism. And the New York Times is correct in this case. Those people are not against the welfare state in principle. They simply want welfare for some people rather than others. And basically what they're saying is, whether or not you're deserving of welfare or any kind of taxpayer funding, is simply determined by which side of an arbitrary line you're born on. Are you born west, or are you born north or south of this imaginary line that was created arbitrarily for political reasons? If you're born on the correct side of the imaginary line, then yeah, you're one of the good guys and we like you, and you're deserving of receiving these taxpayer subsidies. But if you're born on the other side of the line, by chance, no, we don't like you so much, and you don't have any rights. To me, this is a modern way of saying you are born on the wrong side of the tracks. So, no. But anyway, I want to address all these issues relating to the welfare state and why these arguments about immigrants adding to all these immigrants getting taxpayer funding are not a sufficient reason to initiate use of force by the government to block people from entering this country. If we're principled free marketers, principled supporters of capitalism and individual rights, of John Locke's principles, and of having a constitutional liberal republic, the welfare state argument is not a good excuse to block open immigration. So that's what this video is about. Okay, but first off, I have to say something about this welfare burden argument. Actually, it's not accurate, though. We're to believe that when people from Mexico come to the United States, they are a net drain on government coffers. They take more money out of government coffers than they put in. And actually, that's not true. It's not true of legal immigrants, and it's not true of illegal, undocumented immigrants either. In 1997, the National Research Council did a study on this, and the NRC found this finding about legal immigrants. Over their lifetime, they contribute a net gain, a net increase in value to the U.S. economy. And the NRC estimated this value as being the equivalent of $80,000 US in value. That much, $8,000 worth of wealth. That's added to the United States. That's in 1997 US dollars. So you have to adjust for inflation. It's more. In 2015 US dollars, 2016 US dollars, that's more. It's greater than $8,000. But what about illegal immigrants? And we could say, well, legal immigrants are often skilled immigrants. They're often engineers trained in India. They're doctors and engineers. So of course they're going to add value to our economy. What about unskilled people from poor countries like Mexico or Ecuador? Even in their case, they are provide net gain to government coffers, and here's the reason. So, when they are on the payrolls of all these companies like Welch's Grape Juice, when these people are migrant farm workers, and they work on these farms for all these companies, they're on the payrolls of these companies. And these companies have to take money out of their pay for Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, all those federal programs. But guess what? Those people are ineligible to collect that same money. And even though people are trying to give immigrants all of this flack about temporary assistance for needy families, or they're sending their kids to government schools, they don't take into account what is the biggest, which welfare program is the biggest in this country. What the biggest welfare program of all, a welfare program that saps up the most money. And it is Social Security. 2015, for the fiscal year 2015, the military budget was $598 billion. That's how much money was spent on the military last year. That's defense spending. And frankly, that's too much. Most of it's waste. Most of it has to do with people with paying off defense contractors, buying their products overpriced. But that's another story. That's too much. But even that is now dwarfed by Social Security. In 2015, $888 billion was spent for Social Security. It is the biggest welfare program. It dwarfs temporary assistance for needy families. It dwarfs what people pay for in government schools. That's the biggest form of government spending on welfare. And illegal aliens, for the most part, are ineligible for that. They can't collect it. Now, in the past few years, we have seen some articles in the newspapers saying there are some politicians trying to change the law to make it so that undocumented immigrants can collect Social Security. They can get it. But those programs are largely unsuccessful. Those efforts by the politicians are unsuccessful. It's not something going on. It's not something widespread. That's in cases where illegal aliens are allowed to collect Social Security legally, it's still very rare. So no, for the most part, they still don't get to collect Social Security money, and yet they're putting money into the system. And if you want more information on this, there's a PDF I printed out. It's called The Taxation of Undocumented Immigrants, Separate, Unequal, and Without Representation. This was published in 2 places. It was on the Harvard Latino Law Review, Volume 9, this was in the year 2006, and it was also in The Tax Lawyer, Volume 59, Number 3, the Spring 2006 issue. This is by Francine J. Lipman. And so the Cato Institute often cites those figures and uses that as an argument for open immigration. But I'm a bit ambivalent about this. Because in some ways I think it's not good that immigrants are putting money into the welfare system and keeping it alive. My reason for saying this is that on their own, these welfare systems are unsustainable. They're completely unsustainable. In the long run, they cannot be sustained, and they would be unsustainable for the long term, even if there was zero immigration, even if it was the case that immigrants were always a net drain on the government coffers, even if immigrants were always a net drain on the government coffers, if we stopped all immigration and stopped these net drain immigrants from coming into the USA, these welfare programs would be unsustainable for the long term. Then this is very basic to free marketers, but I mean, what happens when you have a welfare system where people can get money out of the system and not put anything in? If there are lots of people putting money into the system, there are lots of people putting money into government coffers who only put money in government coffers, and there's another party of people who only take money out of government coffers, which side would you rather be on? I think most people would rather be on the side that only takes money out of government coffers and doesn't put money in. So more and more people are going to go over to the side of people who only take money out of the government coffers and don't put any in. But there's a problem if everyone wants to be on the receiving end and no one's left on the contributing end. And we can see the big problems with that happening in Western Europe right now. And you can see that happening in Greece, Portugal, Italy, and Spain. This is happening because they are particularly consistent practitioners of welfare state policies. Now, a lot of people would have this misconception and say, no. The European countries that are most consistent in following welfare state policies are, the Nordic countries: Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark. But actually, that's not true. They've practiced more restraint in the welfare policy than the Southern European countries have. Around the 1990s, people in Sweden and Norway said, "Hey, we're getting to a point where there won't be enough money left in the government coffers, to pay for all these welfare programs, so we have to make cutbacks." So they did undergo, reluctantly, of course, because they still believe in the moral idealism of the welfare state. That's what they think is ideal. So they said, okay, we're going to have to be realistic and put the idealism aside and make some cuts to spending. So they did cut some spending programs. They did deregulate a bit. They privatized a bit, grudgingly, of course. But they made cuts so that they don't yet have to face the reckoning. Greece, Spain, Italy, they didn't make all those cuts, at least not to a large enough extent. And that's why they are facing the reckoning much sooner than Norway and Sweden. And that's the reckoning the USA is heading toward. We're not immune to that. But and this is where I'm going to say, in a way, Greece and Italy and Spain are better off, because I think of the welfare state as like an alcoholic or a drunkie. I think having a welfare state it means you have a serious problem, a pathological problem that causes a lot of pain. And I think it's better. I think that when people are in this welfare state and they're accustomed to the government taking care of them, they're like addicts waiting for their next fix. And if you suddenly cut off all these welfare expenditures on them, suddenly they don't know what to do. That's like an addict going through withdrawal, and no one wants to see that. Just as you don't want to see an addict going through the pain of withdrawal, you don't want to see the painful consequences of someone who's long been on welfare suddenly not being on welfare. But just because we don't want to see it, it doesn't mean that in the long term the solution is to just keep on welfare spending. Just as in the long term, the solution is not for us to continue giving an addict his or her fix all the time. I think in the long term it's better that addicts fall flat on their face, hit rock bottom, and face reality sooner rather than later. Well, actually, I have to say that recently some psychologists are saying it's a myth that addicts have to hit rock bottom before they start to make changes. I guess that's good news. But anyway, it's better for people to face reality sooner rather than later, and that applies to the welfare state. So I have huge reservations when people do things to save the welfare state, from collapse, because it doesn't deserve to be saved from collapse. So I have reservations about how Sweden and Norway made some cuts and decided to be more conservative in the welfare state so that they can continue on doing what they're doing. I guess trying to block immigrants from draining the coffers as part of that. But even if all immigration was blocked and no immigrants could take money out of the coffers, it would still be unsustainable for the reasons I gave. So in a way, I think that, maybe in the long run, when we look back, when free markets look back, we'll say, yeah, it seems back in 2015, 2016, Greece was worse off than Sweden and Norway. But at least maybe Greece had to face the reality of the situation much sooner than Sweden and Norway did. And hopefully, I don't know the future, but hopefully we can see, and Greece made changes and got back on track sooner, and finally learned to live without the welfare state sooner than Sweden and Norway did. Just as we can say, okay, this one man, this one addict, fell flat on his face and hit rock bottom, and he finally made changes to his life and got off the habit, got off the drugs sooner than these other people who hit rock bottom much later. So the way I see it, let's say for argument that all these immigrants coming into the USA were a net drain on the system. Well, even if we cut off all immigration, our welfare state would be unsustainable. So what this means is that if immigrants are coming in and draining our coffers at a faster rate, if our coffers are being drained at a rate faster than they otherwise would be, it doesn't make sense to say this problem will be solved simply by stopping immigration. If coffers are being drained at a rate much faster than they otherwise would be, it simply means that immigrants are helping us face the reality of the situation much sooner than we otherwise would. And here's why I say our welfare system is unsustainable. Socialist insecurity is unsustainable. Okay, but people who are talking about Social Security, they might have to revise their arguments a little bit, and here's why. Throughout the 1990s, people at the Cato Institute and places and other think tanks were talking about this demographic transition. They were saying that There will come a time, say in 2015, when all of these baby boomers are in retirement age, and they will be collecting Social Security. And there's a huge demographic gap because that we will reach a point where the baby boomers on the receiving end of Social Security, will outnumber the millennials who are working and putting money into the Social Security system. Now, in 2015, apologists for the welfare state were really happy and they started gloating. They said, hey, guess what? The millennial population is so big that now millennials actually outnumber baby boomers. So we can no longer say there are too few millennials paying for too many baby boomers. There's now at least one millennial putting money into the Social Security system for every baby boomer collecting Social Security. So they started going and said, see, it's still sustainable. But guess what? It's not. The federal government still having problems paying for Social Security, and is issuing federal bonds to pay for it. It's borrowing money, from bondholders to pay baby boomers for their Social Security checks, and that money will have to be paid off. So in order to pay off the bonds, people will have to be taxed. They'll have to pay for the principal plus the interest. So we can't, and there will come a day when we millennials will also retire. Are we going to have to count on the next generation being even bigger than our generation? Well, there'll come a day when we will be on the receiving end of the Social Security system, and it's not realistic to expect it to go on and on and on. So it doesn't make sense to me to blame immigrants for the fact that our welfare system is unsustainable. Even if our population did not increase, it would not be sustainable. Even if there was no immigration, it would be unsustainable. Okay, I want to bring up the topic of native-born babies being born by native-born U.S. citizens in this country. They also increase the size of the population, and guess what? The tax money is spent on them too. So I mean, really, so it doesn't make sense to say it's bad that our size of our population increases, because that means more and more people will be the recipients of taxpayer subsidies, because that complaint does not just apply to immigrants. It also applies to native-born U.S. citizens, people born in this country, because our population keeps growing. That might change. That might change by 2030, because in a lot of wealthier countries, there are many couples having fewer than 2 children. I mean, they're deciding this on their own. You don't have a one-child per family policy like China. But in the present, as I speak right now, people are having kids, and these kids are being sent to our government schools. Tax money is spent on them. So if we really truly believe that population size is so bad that the population size is increasing, I mean, if we say it's so important that we stop taxpayer spending on people, that we ought to limit the size of our population, it won't be enough to block people from immigrating to this country. We would also have to place limits on the number of births that take place in the United States. And I don't think the religious right, anti-abortion people would be so thrilled about that. At least not in this form. But actually, that brings up this whole issue about immigrants and versus native-born people, because I find many of the complaints that people apply to um, to poor immigrants and their kids in the ghetto, they equally apply to low-income native-born U.S. citizens in poor neighborhoods. I already mentioned the whole issue with tax expenditures. People complain about tax money being spent on the children of immigrants. Well, tax money spent on children of low-income U.S. native-born U.S. citizens. And what about assimilation? We often hear very bourgeois people saying, "Oh, these immigrants and their kids are not well assimilated into our culture. They hold on to their own customs. They speak their own weird language, usually Spanish. They're not assimilating into our culture." When I try to talk with these kids of these illegals, I don't understand what they're saying. Well, I think a lot of those complaints could apply to the kids of native-born U.S. citizens in low-income neighborhoods. I mean, we often hear people complaining about slang that young people use, like hip hop slang, gangster rap slang. People, if you're a really bourgeois person, you hear that type of slang. If you hear the type of slang from the kids of native-born U.S. citizens in poor neighborhoods, are you going to understand that? Do you think that's well assimilated into your bourgeois culture? No. So all these alleged assimilation problems that bedevil the children of immigrants, they could be said to apply to children of low-income native-born U.S. citizens. There's also the issue of crime. Like they say that they often say, well, these illegal aliens bring in lots of crime, and we don't just mean the crime of crossing the border illegally. We mean these people who come into the U.S. illegally from Mexico. They're they're drug dealers, they're thieves, and they're rapists. That's Donald Trump's accusation. So if you let all these people from poor countries come into the USA, we're going to have more theft, we're going to have more rape. Well, actually, this has been addressed. You can read this in Reason magazine. You can see it on Reason.com. And the writer Ronald Bailey pointed out that there are studies on this. We find that actually a native-born U.S. citizen is statistically likelier to commit a violent crime against you, such as rape or theft, than is an undocumented immigrant. Now, I've heard conservatives try to dispute these figures and say they're not reliable. I want to address that later too. But anyway, so you see, and we do know that in low-income poor neighborhoods and ghettos, children of native-born U.S. citizens are also vulnerable to fall into lives of crime. Are also vulnerable to joining gangs. So, these things normally happen in poor neighborhoods. So it doesn't really matter. The deciding factor is not whether or not they or their parents were born in other countries. This is a problem of poverty, and it has to be addressed on its own terms. So, because all these supposed problems with undocumented immigrants also occur with children of native-born U.S. citizens in low-income neighborhoods, does this mean we should have some kind of restriction on their existence too? I think that if an anti-immigrationist wants to be consistent, he or she would say yes, all the grievances I have about these illegals are problems that also occur with the children of native-born U.S. citizens in the ghetto. Therefore, yes, there should be government controls on that too. We should have a system similar to our visa quota system applied to children of native-born U.S. citizens in the ghetto. So yes, maybe we should have a quota saying there's we should have a quota saying yes, there should be a limited number of people who are allowed to give should be a law limit a number that places a cap on the number of births that occur in this poor neighborhood. There should be we should have a licensing system that says yes. First, if people are allowed to have kids in this poor neighborhood, if people from this poor neighborhood are allowed to have kids, first they have to get permission from the federal government. But I think a libertarian or an objectivist would say, no, that's an obstruction of your rights. That is evil. It's the initiation of the use of force against people giving birth is not an initiation of the use of force. It should not be considered a crime, even though when you give birth and you're in a poor neighborhood, that might increase the chance of your kids there's a chance that your kid might be a recipient of tax expenditures. And yet, some, I think, would say that should not be forced on the children of native-born U.S. citizens in the poor neighborhoods. And yet, somehow, a lot of these same people seem okay with governmental initiations of use of force against people trying to enter the USA. I think that's a complete double standard. And maybe what I just said was a reductio ad absurdum. I don't think there should be limits on number of people allowed to give birth. You shouldn't need a license to have a kid. I'm kind of worried some Stefan Molyneux type eugenicist or some Donald Trump type might say, maybe that is a good idea I ought to entertain seriously. Maybe we seriously should consider that. No, that's not mindful. And I want to address this other argument. It goes something like this. If you are for freedom, you ought to consider the fact that a lot of people, these foreigners, have illiberal ideas in their heads, and we're going to feel the consequences of their illiberal ideas. It goes something like this. Well, people want welfare, so what's going to happen is all these Mexicans are going to come to the USA, and even if they can't vote, they're going to have kids in the USA, and the kids are going to vote, and probably those kids are going to be sympathetic to the welfare state. So all the kids of these illegal immigrants are going to vote for Democrats, and they will specifically, especially be partial to the Democrats who want to increase government spending, want to increase welfare spending. So therefore, if you want to preserve, and this is going to make it harder for us to create a free society, it's going to be hard for us to make the USA into a consistent constitutional liberal Republican night watchman state. So if you want a freer society, then you ought to support every measure we can to stop these people with illiberal ideas from coming into the country and burdening us with kids who will vote for politicians we don't like. There are so many ethical problems with this argument. It's embarrassing. Frankly, it's embarrassing. Okay, so here's where I'm going to start. First off, actually, the empirical data do not support it. Alex Nowresta, I apologize if I pronounced that wrong. Alex Nowresta from the Keele Institute and another author did a study on this. They looked into, at places in the United States where there's a lot of immigrants, especially Hispanic immigrants, lots of immigrants from Africa, North Africa, and their kids. They looked at those places and they compared them to places with fewer immigrants, especially fewer Hispanic immigrants and fewer African immigrants. They looked at those places. They looked at voting patterns, how people vote there, whether people vote for politicians who favor expansions in the welfare state. And they had several findings. First of all, when people immigrate to the USA, and note these results are for the USA, not for Europe. So the results might be different in Western Europe. But here's what happened in the USA. When immigrants arrive in the USA, it happens that with every successive generation that goes on, so people from foreign countries come to the USA and they have kids in the USA and the kids are U.S. citizens and vote. With every successive generation is more assimilated politically with the people around them than the previous generation. So what happens is if Hispanics go to a red state, from a foreign country, if they're from a foreign country and from South America, and they go to a red state, and they have kids, maybe their kids are going to vote for Democrat, but with every successive generation, every generation that goes on, their voting pattern is more like those of everyone around them. So if they're in a red state, the grandkids and great grandkids of the original immigrants are likely to vote for the Republicans. Anyway, Alexander Resta and his co-author found that that there's no correlation between Hispanic immigration or African immigration and people voting for Democrats and expand the welfare state. So that stereotype is rather unfounded. But I want to talk about why the argument is ridiculous in principle. And even if the kids of Hispanic immigrants and African immigrants did have illiberal ideas and did vote for illiberal politicians, that would not be a good enough reason to use government force to stop unlicensed immigrants from entering the country. The reason is that it's a form of thought control. It's a form of thought police. It's not. This is what stopping the initiation of the use of force is about. It's not about stopping illiberal ideas. It's not about stopping illiberal actions. Okay, if I go around the neighborhood beating people up, then I'm the one initiating the use of force. Okay, and you'd be right to call the cops on me and have them exercise retaliatory force on me and send me to prison. But what if I'm just imagining violence? What if I write a book that's violent, about violent characters who go around beating up the neighborhood? That's just art. It's not the same thing, is it? So it's not sufficient to say, oh, because it's not sufficient to say Stewart wrote this book about violent people. Well, kids might read this book about violent people and go around beating up other people in the neighborhood. Therefore, we ought to censor Stewart and send him to prison and ban his book by force and outlaw the selling of this book because someone who reads Stewart's book might act violently. The same principle applies to immigrants supposedly having illiberal ideas in their heads. Okay, if someone comes over from Mexico or Syria and actually does violence, does an honor killing or anything like that, of course that person should go to prison. That person should be sent to prison by police, by armed government agents. But what about a person having illiberal ideas in his or her head and not acting on them yet? That's something altogether different. Okay, like I want to talk about. Here's an example. Soon after the French Revolution in the 1790s, Maximilien Robespierre, I apologize for my mispronunciation. Maximilien Robespierre said, "I am an advocate. I am a principal defender of absolute free speech." And I think that for absolute free speech to be secure for the long term, our revolution has to be secure for the long term. We have to be against counter-revolutionaries. We have to be against conservatives advocating counter-revolution, or even being sympathetic to counter-revolution, covertly, or we can't even allow subtext that might be critical of the revolution. You know why? Because if people spout opinions that might be critical of a revolution, they might give conservative kind of revolutionaries ideas, and they might take over again and start censorship. Therefore, I have to put a stop to that, and therefore we're going to institute censorship of any ideas that might be counter-revolutionary. Because I'm looking at it for the long haul. In the long, you might think I'm for censorship in the short term, but no, in the long term, this is what will preserve free speech. I have to protect absolute free speech. I am going to outlaw speech that might encourage governmental censorship. That was Robespierre's policy. And to me, that is what a lot of people, that's what the vibe I get from people who are trying to outlaw Islam in the United States. Now, I am not blind to the dangers of militant Islam. I'm not Glenn Greenwald. I know militant Islam is dangerous. And when radical Muslims attack people for their speech, I'm not Murray Roth. I'm not a Rothbardian saying, "Oh, this is blowback. They're just striking back against the West for its Western imperialism." When radical Islamists murdered Theo van Gogh in the Netherlands, it was not blowback or retaliation for some military action, from some action on the part of the Netherlands military. It was based on Theo van Gogh's speech. Yes, I'm fully aware that militant Islamists are illiberal. They're not just striking back against some military action on the part of the West. They really do want to police people's minds. And I recognize that problem. But you see, when people act violently in the name of Islam, the issue itself is the violence, and that's what there has to be police action against. If a Muslim father performs an honor killing and murders his daughter because he thinks that's consistent with Islam, of course the police of the Western country ought to put that man in prison. But that's because all murder is wrong and has to be stopped. All violence is wrong and has to be stopped. The government, the police action itself should not have a policy with regard to just the word Islam or people calling themselves Muslims. So I have a big problem when someone says Islam itself should be banned, that anyone who calls him or herself Muslim should be banned by force, that some kid who's never done anything violent, tries to come to the USA from Malaysia. I think that him calling himself Muslim is not a good enough reason to have armed government agents stop him from coming into the USA. And this whole notion about trying to stop the kids of Mexicans from voting for Democrats is completely ridiculous. The reason I live in Hawaii, where everyone's a Democrat, and you don't have to be the child of Mexican immigrants to vote for Democrats. That's something native-born people in Hawaii do on their own. So, because I don't think because I'm surrounded by Democrats, I don't think I should be saying, "Wow, I wish the Border Patrol would deport all my neighbors because they vote for Democrats and therefore take away my freedom." No. We're supposed to be a constitutional liberal republic, and we free marketers are supposed to be believers in that principles, which means we also be practitioners of those principles. If we hear people spouting illiberal ideas, but not directly beating us up, we can still speak. We have a part to speak. If we hear native-born citizens or the children of undocumented immigrants talking about voting for the Democrats, we can talk to them about that. We can discuss this with them. We can tell them our ideas, and we can try to persuade them to vote differently. Maybe vote Republican or vote for the Libertarian. As long as we have some free speech in this country, that's what we ought to use. If we hear people spouting illiberal ideas, but not acting violently, not directly, not beating us up or beheading us, the solution is for us to talk back to them, for us to counter illiberal ideas with our free enterprise ideas. And that's complete, and then that's completely anathema to trying to use government agents to block people from entering this country peacefully because we're scared that their kids are going to vote for a political party that we don't approve of. I mean, that's really a form of thought control. Remember, I've said this many times before. I said it in the previous video. I said it in the Invisible Gun video uploaded by Faitasi37. Government action is force. What the Border Patrol does is backed by force. Deportation is a form of violence. When people are being deported from this country, we send armed government agents after them to restrain them physically. And if they struggle back, the amount of violence used against them will escalate. When border agents are catching someone trying to cross the border agents try to restrain them physically. And if they struggle more, the amount of force the border agents use will escalate. They will become more violent. They can use guns if they think that that's necessary. The amount of danger renders that appropriate. So if I said, well, the government ought to keep Mexicans out of this country, USA, because I'm scared of their kids voting for Democrats, what I'm saying is that I want the government to initiate the use of force against those Mexicans because I'm scared of how their kids might vote. It's trying to initiate government force against people based on ideas. It is trying to police their thoughts. It's a form of thought policing. It's a form of thought control. So this is what gets me when when conservatives say, or people call themselves libertarians or objectivists say, we have to stop these Mexicans or these Muslims from coming into this country because if they do, their kids are going to vote for illiberal politicians, and they're going to be the politicians will be Big Brother trying to police our thoughts. They're going to establish Sharia law. They're going to create a caliphate that will police our thoughts. Guess what? There'll be Big Brother policing our thoughts. Guess what? You are the thought police. You are Big Brother. You are the one who, supposedly in the name of freedom, are saying the government should initiate the use of force to police people's thoughts. You are the one trying to impose your own type of Sharia law. And what really exasperates me here is that this whole argument about how immigration control is necessary to stop immigrants' kids from voting for the liberal parties. That argument was actually made by John Hospers, the first person ever to run for president of the United States on the Libertarian Party ticket. Can you believe that? The first guy who ran for president as a libertarian was advocating this completely illiberal, thought-policing Big Brother policy. So that was really frustrating. Now I want to address another matter, a related matter. So some people who call themselves libertarians or objectivists say that they do have a free market solution. They do have an idea. They say, yeah, we do have to stop illegal immigrants. And we have a much better solution that is consistent with free market principles. And this can be termed immigration by invitation, or more specifically, invitation only immigration. And what they say is this: they say, okay, if people come into this country without with no one's permission but their own, they could be troublemakers. They might be criminals. They might be terrorists. They might be, members of ISIS, things like that. So we can't let people come into this country peacefully with no one's permission but their own. They have to have someone else's permission before they enter the country. So this is what we do. They are only allowed to come to the United States if a private business or a private charity sponsors them and vouches for them and pays for their lodging and all of that. These people have to be approved before they cross any border, before they are allowed into U.S. territory. So it goes like this. So let's say we want this person from Mexico to come to our company to work for us. First, we have to do a background check on them. And if they are approved, then we are allowed to bring them into the United States. We're allowed to transport them across the border and have them work on our vineyard. Okay, now here's my response to that argument, that suggestion. It's completely implausible. It's completely unrealistic. It completely ignores the nature of what people experience in developing countries, like Mexico, like African countries. You have to look at what actually goes on in these developing countries. They are poor. They are less developed. A lot of people in developing countries who are poor and want to get into the USA, they are in villages that are just barely developed by U.S. standards. I mean, by the standards of a lot of USA dwellers, we could practically call that the wilderness. These people are living in villages at the edges of jungles, or they're living in the desert where there's just a few people. They're living in the desert or on farms. There are very few people around, and very few of these people have access to electronic communications. Very few of them have access to the internet. And there are even places in India where people have access to the internet, or there is internet access, and even then it's hard to get information on them. Or Pakistan. There's several reasons for this. Okay, first of all, there are lots of these poor places. Even when they're industrialized, they're half connected to the world, half industrialized, and half wilderness. Like, there are places in India where you can have like a really high tech office building where people are connected to the internet and they're doing IT work, and like right next to them, just a block away from them, maybe even walking distance from them, there's a shanty town. And there's complete slums, and they're without adequate sewage maintenance. There are villages in Africa where people do have some electricity, where they have access to cell phones, but they still live in houses that many of us in the U.S. would consider low tech. And just because they have access to the internet, it doesn't mean that they have internet access throughout the entire day, or on a basis as regularly as we do. Sometimes the electricity goes on and off unexpectedly. So, as you can imagine, record keeping is not easy. It's not easy for people in these places to leave a paper trail for companies in the U.S. to investigate. Even in cities, this is a problem. Even in the city part of many developing countries, where they do have electricity, where they do have computers, There's also still a lot of corruption. Government officials are not very good at keeping records. Even private businesses have a hard time keeping the records because of the situation, because of the corruption, because they're so insecure. They could be hurt by criminals at any moment. So pretty much a lot of the developing world is behind an iron curtain in terms of whether U.S. companies can gain access to lots of information about poor people in these countries. So if I'm a U.S. business owner and I want to hire people from Mexico or Ecuador or from African countries, and what if I'm willing to hire people who are very low skilled people? What if I'm willing to hire low skilled people who are in these low developed areas? If it's the case where I still have to do some kind of background check and investigate their histories and investigate histories and have to vouch for them that way before I can bring them to the USA legally, I'm in a bind. How am I supposed to do that when such information is not readily available? This is rigging the system. Basically, if I want to bring in foreigners from other rich countries like Finland or France, well, they're more first world. They're more first world. They're better at keeping records, so I can bring them in pretty easily. But if I'm willing to give a chance to people in the third world, I'm still not going to be able to do that if I have to do this kind of rigorous background check on them first. If I first have to prove that they're not criminals. Notice how there's this presumption of guilt. In the United States, we're supposed to have a legal presumption of innocence. Even if a foreigner is charged for a crime in the United States, if they're in a U.S. court, they're supposed to have a legal presumption of innocence. But when it comes to this policy of invitation-only immigration, there is a presumption of guilt, and the onus is upon us U.S. people, us U.S. sponsors, us U.S. charities, or U.S. business owners. The onus is on us to prove someone is not a violent criminal. And notice how it's still much easier for people in rich countries to get in this way than people from poor countries, when in most cases it's the people from the poor countries who are more craving to get into the USA and work for jobs at low pay. And I think this is not a coincidence. I think it's not an accident. I think that I suspect that people who are suggesting this invitation-only immigration, they, on some level, they know, but don't necessarily say out loud. They know that if their suggestion were implemented, the odds are that the system would be biased in favor of bringing more white Europeans or more rich East Asians into the country, and it would implicitly still keep out a lot of Africans and Chicano people. And I think we should have, and when you're for a truly open immigration system, you're for true open immigration. True open immigration is colorblind. A peaceable person who wants to come peaceably can, regardless of the race, regardless of whether the majority of those people are African or East Asian or Chicano. That should not be rigged at all. So this is why I don't favor open immigration. Why I don't favor invitation-only immigration, and why I think it's a cop-out. It's an illiberal system pretending to be a libertarian solution. And I want to talk about how my argument against invitation-only immigration is actually inspired by Ayn Rand. Notice how Ayn Rand was in Russia. It was one of those poor countries, and where records were not well kept. And when I first time I heard someone suggesting this invitation-only immigration, first time I heard someone suggest it, it was a person who claimed to be an objectivist, a person who claimed to be adherent to Ayn Rand's philosophy. And this person said, yeah, a person should only be allowed to come into the USA from a poor country if this person is sponsored by a U.S. organization like a company or a charity that did a background check on that person first and cleared that person and proved that that person was not a violent criminal or a terrorist. And I thought, if that policy were implemented, Ayn Rand would not have been able to enter the USA. In order for Ayn Rand to enter to the USA, she would need, someone like Cecil B. DeMille to vouch for her. Cecil B. DeMille would have to know, would have to name her specifically. So Cecil B. DeMille doesn't know specific people in Russia. He doesn't know specific Russians. And yet, for that policy to work and get Ayn Rand into the USA, Cecil B. DeMille would have to know who Ayn Rand is. He would have to peer across the Iron Curtain. You would have to find all this information when the information is not available to him at all. And then he would have to find a way to prove Ayn Rand and get her to the USA. That's not realistic at all. In real life, what Ayn Rand did was, she's poor. People in the USA don't know much about her. She has to get to the USA first. And once she's in the USA, on US soil, that's when she can look for a job. That's when she can become acquainted with businesses and charities. She got acquainted with a charity called Hollywood Studio Club. It was a mutual aid society. She got acquainted with Cecil B. DeMille, and he hired her. But she had to get to the USA first. And then only then could she come in contact with these charities and businesses who could learn about her, who could investigate her, who could vouch for her. And the same thing applies to people presently in African villages, people who are in low-income communities in Mexico and in South America. They have to get to the USA first. Then they can look for jobs. Then they can go to charities. Then we can get to know them. That's how it works. All right. So I want to address another issue. Around the time that the Syrian refugee crisis was starting, I have to admit I didn't pay much attention to it. But I was reading a book by Rebecca Stott called Darwin's Ghosts. And it's about the history of evolutionary theory. And she talks about all these people were talking about some aspect of evolutionary theory before Charles Darwin did. Of course, he's the one who synthesized it. He's the one who put it all together. So you could say his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was talking about evolution before he was, and Lamarck was talking about evolution before Darwin was. But Darwin talked about it in a more complete fashion. So it's not true that Darwin is unoriginal. He is original because he integrated all of it. And he integrated a part of what Aristotle was saying. So that book has a section on Aristotle, and the book talks about Aristotle's life, and used terms for Aristotle I thought were interesting. He said Aristotle was an immigrant to Athens, and first he was an immigrant to Athens, and then he became a refugee to Lesbos. And it told the story of Aristotle's life, and I had read those details before, but before I had not thought of it in those terms, immigrant and refugee, and yet they do apply. Aristotle was born near Macedon. Remember, this is the time of city-states. This is not the time of nation-states. This is the time of city-states, where pretty much if you're in a city, the city is considered your country, and everyone outside of your city is considered a foreigner. So Aristotle was born near Macedon, and he went to live in Athens. Athenians thought anyone outside of the city of Athens was a foreigner. Therefore, Rebecca's thought is right. Aristotle was an immigrant. He was a Macedonian immigrant in Athens. Now, around this time, Philip of Macedon, who would be the father to Alexander the Great, was starting his campaigns of conquest. He was conquering all these city-states. And these Athenians were worried they might be next. And they became fearful that any Macedonian immigrant in their city, Athens, was a spy for Philip of Macedon or some loyalist to Philip of Macedon. So they thought they're the terrorists of their day. So they were scared. What if this Aristotle guy is not loyal to us? What if he's unassimilated? What if he's actually, this illiberal terrorist who is more loyal to Philip of Macedon? So a lot of people violently threatened Aristotle. They damaged his property, and that's why he happened to flee from Athens. Of course, this is not a free time. They don't understand freedom the way we do. Not even Aristotle did. So he tried to pack up some of his belongings, including some of his slaves. That's not good. I don't approve of slavery. But he even packed up some of his slaves, and he took his property and his slaves with him to Lesbos. And Rebecca Stott said, well, that makes him a political refugee to Lesbos. And that's true. The word applies. And I tweeted about that. I wrote on Twitter, wow, Aristotle was an immigrant and a refugee. I never thought of him in those terms before. And a lot of conservatarians just assumed I was talking about Syrian refugees. They thought I was saying that just because Aristotle was a immigrant and refugee, that I'm saying Syrian refugees are good and you should like them. And they started tweeting these angry tweets at me about how I'm an apologist for Islam. I'm an apologist for Islamist radicals. And I thought, what? So that's when I thought the situation really was going too far. So I have to tell you what my position is on countries that are dominated by Islam. There are some instances where I might concede that the U.S. government is correct to limit immigration, but those are only in extreme emergency situations, such as in war. Okay, here's a hypothetical scenario where I might concede there should be a limit to immigration. Let's say the United States declared war against Syria. It would have to be a formal declaration of war. It's not, when I say that, I mean, throughout many decades, a lot of U.S. presidents have unilaterally declared war on other countries. Not declared war. They've unilaterally started wars against other countries without congressional approval. Like President Clinton did that when he was approved the bombing of Kosovo. He did that without congressional approval. I would, if the President of the United States decided on his own to start bombing Syria and send troops against Syrians, and he did not have congressional approval, I would not be okay with government limits on Syrian immigration. And there would have to be congressional approval of a declaration of war, and I have to clarify that as well. When Congress did vote about the Iraq War, but they did not actually vote on a formal declaration of war. Those were not the words they used. The terms they used were, they voted on, quote, a show of force, unquote. And they purposely used those terms instead of declaring war because they thought it was a loophole. They thought that if they voted on a show of force, it meant they were bound by a set of rules that would not be the same as a set of rules that apply to a formal declaration of war. Okay, no, I'm not okay with any immigration controls against Middle Eastern people unless Congress Congress does a formal declaration of war against a Middle Eastern country like, say, Syria. If Congress makes a formal declaration of war against Syria, then under those circumstances, I might concede, okay, there should be immigration restriction against Syrians. And even in that case, I want the war to be done very quickly, and once the war is over, restrictions on immigration should be lifted. Now, what is my opinion on Syrian refugees currently? Well, frankly, it was not Syrian refugees who actually did the attack on Paris, France. It was not a Syrian refugee who did the shooting in San Bernardino, California. That was actually a native-born U.S. citizen. His wife, who was an accomplice, was an immigrant from Saudi Arabia, but the mastermind behind that was a native-born U.S. citizen. So immigration restriction would not have stopped him. I don't think so. And so I think that presently we don't have good reason to believe that Syrian refugees are all Islamists trying to infiltrate the United States and trying to destroy us. Actually, those are people fleeing from the radical Islamists. Not all those people are even Muslim. So I think there is too much of a presumption of guilt against the Syrian refugees. And currently, I really don't approve of Ted Cruz saying that Syrian refugees should be allowed into the country because if they're Christian, but they should be barred if they're Muslim. I think that goes against the non-establishment clause of the U.S. Constitution. I think implicitly in practice that is conveying the message that the federal government is favoring the religion of Christianity. So I don't approve of Ted Cruz's decision. I don't think someone calling him or herself Muslim is sufficient reason to believe. I don't think it's sufficient reason for the government to assume that that person is a militant Islamist terrorist trying to overthrow the government or trying to establish Sharia law. Now, Hawaii is currently one of the U.S. states that will still accept Syrian refugees. So some people might say, "Oh, Stewart, he's making all this lofty rhetoric. He's trying to sound like this big idealist, but how is he going to react if Syrian refugees move next door to him?" Well, that might actually be a possibility one day. Hawaii is one of the states that is accepting Syrian refugees. There might come a day when I live next to Syrian refugees. And will I still approve of immigration then? Or am I going to eat my words and regret what I said earlier? We'll see. But I think Aristotle, even though when I first tweeted about Aristotle being an immigrant and refugee, even though at first I wasn't trying to defend Syrian refugees, now I do think this is a good, important example of how Aristotle, how we shouldn't take for granted benefits we can get from immigration and from accepting refugees or asylum seekers. There's a political distinction between asylum seeker and refugee. Maybe that's for another day. And I want to talk about some other things. So I started defending open immigration on Twitter, and lots of people were angry. And they said, "Oh, them illegals never did anything good for us." So I want to give a few examples of them illegals doing good things for us. You might have a smartphone or a dumb phone. You might have a mobile phone that takes photographs. The fact that if you are grateful for the fact that your mobile phone can take a photograph, you should thank an illegal alien. It was an illegal alien who invented that type of app. He was an illegal alien from France. His name was Philippe Kahn. He started the company Borland International. So he's French, and he came to the USA legally on a student visa, but he overstayed that visa. Many illegal aliens come to the USA legally on student visas, and they overstay them. So he overstayed his visa, and from then on, he was an illegal alien. And he started the company Borland International, and of course, eventually, immigration officials found out he overseas visa, and he hired. But by this time, he was rich. He hired lots of lawyers to deal with that. Now he is a legal resident of the USA. But the time that he spent wrangling over that meant distracted him, and he was less productive as company that I think than he otherwise would have been. But eventually, he thought, what if I can use my mobile phone to take a photograph? And so he worked on that. He's an inventor. He worked on that, and he's one main reason why today we can take photographs with our mobile phones. Well, I can't because I don't have. My phone is low tech. That's when I like GMOs. I like high tech stuff. I like high tech, genetically engineered stuff. But when it comes to telecommunications, I'm very low tech. I'm a laggard there, so I can't take photos with my cell phone. But if you like taking photos with your cell phone, thank an illegal alien. People might say, well, he's European and white. What about Mexicans? What about illegals from Mexico? Well, I want to tell you about Dr. Alfredo Quinone Hinojosa. He first came to the United States as a Mexican. He hopped over a fence, came to the USA, and he didn't have a visa. And he was a migrant farm worker. He worked for very low pay. So far, it sounds like the stereotype, right? But what people don't often know con is that these migrant farm workers often save their money, just as Taiwanese women working in sweatshops save their money so that they could give a better life for their kids, and their kids didn't have to work in sweatshops. Alfredo Quijone Hinojosa saved his money, and he eventually sent himself to medical school. He became one of the world's foremost brain surgeons, and today he performs brain operations. He saves the lives of native-born U.S. citizens. So if you have a brain operation and it saves your life, you might have an illegal alien to thank for that. And finally, I want to talk about spare parts. This was an article in Wired magazine by Joshua Davis, and in 2014, this was made into a documentary called Underwater Dreams. And Joshua Davis took his Wired article and he turned it into this book, which I had borrowed from the library. And it was also made into a dramatization, a movie called Spare Parts, starring Marissa Tomei and Jamie Lee Curtis and George Lopez. And what happened was, there are these kids in high school. They're at a high school in Arizona called Carl Hayden Community High School. It's very low income. It's in the ghetto. It's high crime. All the stereotypes are there. And more than half the kids there are either the kids of undocumented immigrants or they are undocumented themselves, because a lot of times they were snuck over from Mexico by their mothers when they were still babies. And usually people are very low, don't expect much from them. People think, oh, these people are always going to be poor, they're going to always work for jobs for low pay, or they're going to join gangs. But Oscar Vasquez, one of the students, had different ideas. He helped start a robot building club in Arizona at Carl Hayden High School. This is in the middle of the desert. There are no beaches nearby. But he started he said, hey, let's build an underwater robot. He heard about these underwater robot competitions. The idea is that there are all these teams from all these different colleges and high schools who submerge their robot in an indoor swimming pool, and it has to perform specific tasks. Ideas that eventually this is a test. They eventually want to have submersible robots that go underneath the ocean and perform tasks that humans can't. They want these underwater robots to go underneath the ocean and explore these sunken ships, and recover lost items or search for oil, things like that. So Oscar Vasquez, one of the students, started an underwater robot competition under the Robot Club, Robot Building Club. He recruited people like Christian Arcega, and even though they're high school students, they decided to enter the college division. They decided to compete against all these colleges who are participating in the robot building competition. They went up against MIT. MIT had a $10,000 grant from Exxon Mobil, and the MIT's robot had Exxon logo on it really big. As for Oscar Vazquez's team, their robot, they spent $800 on their robot. Now in their competition, what they're supposed to do is they're supposed to submerge their robot underneath the pool, and it's supposed to go to this underwater object and extract a liquid from it. During the competition, and I think Oscar Vazquez's team was the only high school team competing in the college competition. They're also the only all Hispanic team. So anyway, turns out that MIT's robot could not extract the liquid in the competition, but Oscar Vazquez's team did. They did what MIT could not do, and MIT was second place in the competition. Oscar Vazquez's team was first place. That was in 2004, and they've become huge role models to kids at Carl Hayden High School. Now, the team's burgeoning. They send a team every year, and sometimes, often many of their teams still win. It's happening to this day, and I think they give me hope. They give lots of people hope. They give lots of people in Arizona hope. They are implementing the American dream. I think it's so silly when we advocates of free immigration are called apologists for socialism or apologists of the welfare state by conservative anti-immigrationists. It's completely the opposite on so many levels. Okay, first of all, you hear this argument all the time. You say, we should think of the United States, our country, as a big house. You wouldn't let just anyone into your house, right? Stuart, you're for open immigration. Will you just let any vagabond inside your house? If you won't let any vagabond inside your house, why should we let people inside the bigger house that's the USA? That whole argument conflates private property with government socialist property. In case you haven't noticed, the real estate of the United States is not supposed to be all socialist government property. We're not living under Henry George's real estate socialism completely. In a constitutional liberal Republican like Washington state, we have something called private ownership of plots of real estate. It's like this. You can think of the grid showing all different private plots of land as being like a jigsaw puzzle. Okay, maybe this is my private plot of land, and this is your private plot of land. This is my homestead, and this is your homestead. Maybe we're neighbors. Our private plots are adjacent to one another. In a capitalist society, what this means is I can do what I want peaceably on my private property, and you can do what you want peaceably on your private property. Now, occasionally we can have boundary disputes. There are gray areas, like what if I play music really loud at 2 a.m.? Am I infringing on your private property rights? We might go to court over something like that, or maybe we might go to a private arbitrator. Anyway, those gray areas do exist. But for the most part, if what I'm doing doesn't interfere with your life, you have no say over what's going on my private plot. Likewise, if you're not interfering with what I'm doing, I don't have a say with what's going on. Like, what if you're in an interracial relationship and I don't approve of that, and you're having sex with someone of another race on your private plot of land? Is it my place to say, hey, you can't do that? How dare you have sex with someone of a different race on your own property when I don't approve of that? You would be right to say, buzz off. That's none of your business. Well, the same principle applies to having foreigners on your private plot of land. Private property means if you truly own your private property legally, what this means is that you can invite whomever you want peaceably on your own private plot of land. You can have them lodge there, and you can have they can do any you and they can do anything that you want on your private plot of land, as long as it does not initiate the use of force on person or private property of anyone else, such as me. So, and you can do this without my permission. So let's say you have your private plot of land, and you invite Mexicans onto your private plot of land, and you let them stay there. And you do this without any permission from anyone. You do this without permission from me or without the government. In a free society, what if I don't approve of this? What if I say, hey, I'm your neighbor, and I don't like all these Mexicans on your land? In a free society, you can say, well, too bad. If you don't want to associate with Mexicans, you don't have to invite them on your private plot of land. But since Mexicans and me are not interfering with your life, we're not initiating use of force on you or your property, you have no business telling me who I can invite peaceably onto my private plot of land. And I don't need your permission. That's the policy of a free society. But what about current system? What if I, as an anti-immigration, say, no, we're all in this together. So yeah, I'm going to go to the government and we're going to say, yeah, you do need permission from me and the government to invite Mexicans onto your land. Before you invite any Mexicans onto your private plot of land, you need permission from me and the government first. What is the implication of that? What is this in practice? If it's the case that you can't invite Mexicans onto your land on your own without permission of third parties, you don't have the power. If the government and me can veto that and overrule that, then the implication is that your private plot of land does not actually belong to you. It belongs to the state. The implication of that is that if the government can control your property and overrule or dictate over who you may invite peaceably onto your own private plot of land, the implication is that your land, everyone's land, belongs to the state. It means that this is a form of socialism with real estate. Nationalized, collectivized, socialized control of real estate. So when you say to me, I cannot, the fact is, in a free society, if I can invite whoever I want on my land, and including Mexicans, and if they consent to being on my land, that's not business of any third party. We don't need their permission. But if we need permission of everyone else, all of our neighbors, everyone in the community, of the government first, then the implication is that our land and everyone's land belongs to the state. So advocating immigration control in practice implicitly means advocating socialized control of real estate. So it really gets me how so many conservatives and even people who call themselves libertarians or objectivists, all these people who say they're against socialism, such as socialism of healthcare, why are you advocating socialist control over other people's private real estate? No. The way I see it, people who cross the border illegally are not trespassers, because most of the border in that desert is not private property, and I really don't think government property is a legitimate institution. Now, there are cases of private plots of land being on the border that are disturbed by people crossing the border illegally, so I do admit that's a gray area. But even here, I don't think the anti-immigration argument holds. The way I see it, you can think of it this way. I think the coming to the nuisance doctrine applies. If it was the case, let's say I live on the U.S. Mexican border. If it was the case, I was living there, and no, let's say I'm living there, and for decades, people are not crossing there. People are not seeing me across. People are not crossing there at all, and so I'm fine. I'm accustomed to that. Then all of a sudden, a huge wave of immigrants come from the south, and they overwhelm me, and they trample on my lawn, just trampling on my land unexpectedly. This is a huge surprise. It's never happened before. You could say this is a nuisance being imposed upon me. This is an initiation of the use of force upon me, and I did not consent to this. In that case, yeah, I would have a legitimate complaint. But let's say that's one scenario. But let's talk about another scenario. Let's say people have been crossing that border, crossing that border for decades already. Decades, decades. Now I don't live there yet. But then I buy a property there. I'm warned that people are crossing that border all the time. I know about that beforehand. I'm notified of that beforehand. And they've been doing that for decades. And once I'm there, well, then I get so mad about those people trampling on the land. Do I still have a legitimate grievance? My answer is no. That's called coming to the nuisance doctrine. If you're minding your own business and then unexpectedly a nuisance is imposed upon you, then you do have a legitimate grievance and say the nuisance can be stopped by the government. But if the so-called nuisance is already there, it's already grandfathered and already established, and you take the initiative to go there, then you don't have a grievance. So, insofar as people have already been crossing the border for decades, I don't think anyone who moves there moves onto the border and buys a plot of land on the border. I don't think that person, if anyone does that, I don't think that person has a legitimate grievance when people start trampling over that land to cross over from Mexico to the United States. And once those people are over, they will be staying on private plots of land of landholders who consent to them being there. So it's completely unfounded to say that we advocates of open immigration are apologists for socialism or the welfare state. It's those saying the government ought to stop us from controlling our own land, from inviting who we want on our own land, who are advocating a type of socialism. So freedom of migration is very basic freedom. We got to look at the word enterprise. And often when we say free enterprise, people think it means only commerce. And commerce is a big part of that. I think commerce is great. Peaceful, consensual commerce is great. I love it. It is an important part of free enterprise. But that's not the only type of enterprise there is. Enterprise means action, means going through an undertaking, means taking the initiative, initiating something constructive and important. All peaceable action is a form of enterprise. And all peaceable action is free enterprise. That includes the free movement of people. So free migration is free enterprise. Free migration is not anathema to free enterprise. It's not in contradiction to free enterprise. Free migration is free enterprise. And opposition to free migration is opposition to free enterprise, by definition. So I want to end on a final note. So I was looking at an argument in a comment section of a website. It was an objectivist website among people call themselves objectivists, both for immigration, open immigration, and those against open immigration. And one of the self-proclaimed objectivists who's against immigration said something like this. She said, I don't see why there is any natural right to immigration. I don't see why there's any natural right for people outside of the USA to come to the USA. I don't see why there's any right to that at all. Therefore, I don't think it's any type of initiation of use of force to keep out those people. Okay, I'm going to explain why there is such a right. Under freedom, in a free society, peaceable action, freedom of any peaceable action is the default. I'm talking about a capitalist society, a society objectivists want, a constitutional liberal republic, a constitutional liberal republican night watchman state. In that type of society, the default is freedom. It means you can do anything that is peaceful. You don't need anyone else's permission. Anything that's peaceful. It means you can say whatever you want. You can insult the president. You can insult Ayn Rand. You can insult the Prophet Muhammad. You can do anything that's peaceful. You can do whatever way you want that's peaceful. It doesn't initiate use of force on anyone else or their property. And under that system, that freedom of enterprise is the default. And if anyone wants the government to, remember, government is always backed by force. If anyone wants government agents to use force against you to stop what you're doing, it is incumbent upon that person to explain why that force is justified. In other words, when I want to live my life peaceably, that I don't have to explain myself. If you want the government to do interfere with anything I do, the onus is upon you to explain why I should be restricted. The onus is not upon me to explain why I should have that freedom. And that principle applies to inviting people peaceably from across the wrong side of the tracks onto my private plot of land. Same thing applies if I'm from the wrong side of the tracks and someone invites me to go to his private plot of land. I shouldn't have to explain to you why there's a right to immigration. If you want the government to restrict it, the onus is upon you to explain why the government ought to do that. The onus is upon you to explain how immigration is so horrible that that's the initiation of use of force against you or your property. And I think all so-called arguments, so-called libertarians and objectivists against open immigration, they have all failed. And I want to talk about Ayn Rand's first famous novel, We the Living. I'm going to give a spoiler. It takes place in Russia, and at the end, the heroine, Kira, decides she's going to cross a national border illegally. And she doesn't do this. She doesn't wait for anyone else's permission. She does it on her own. And I thought, what if I were in a similar position, but in Congo, or in Ecuador, or Mexico? If I am living in a kleptocracy where my rights are not respected by the government, or not protected by the government, but it's disrespected, if I'm poor because of the government's policies, destroying, well, if I'm starving, I'm not going to wait 7 years or 5 years. I am going to seek greater freedom, and I'm not going to wait for your permission or anyone else's. That I'm not going to wait for anyone's permission to live my life peaceably, because that's what it's about. It's about living my life. And that sounds very selfish, and it is. It's selfish, and it's peaceably selfish. And I don't see why people from Mexico or Ecuador or the Philippines or even Syria should have to apologize for that. No, they are trying to live their lives peaceably. That's even the title of another illegal immigrant, Yanni Park. She wrote a book, came out in 2015, called In Order to Live, about her life in North Korea. She lived in North Korea, and she crossed the border illegally into China. And North Korea is so extreme that when North Koreans get to China, they think China is free in comparison, and they marvel at the relative freedom in China. But there's a problem in China. China has a government policy of sending illegal aliens from North Korea back to North Korea. They deport North Koreans back to North Korea. And so what happens is, a lot of people in China who deal with illegal immigrants, they know they can get away with a lot. They know they can beat up North Korean immigrants. and exploit them, all sorts of things. And they know they can get away with it because if they do these crimes to North Koreans are reluctant to go to the police because what happens if they go to the police? They're at risk of being deported. So they just put up with it. And then a lot of more Chinese come along and say, see, look at all these problems. This is caused by North Korean immigration. This is caused by immigration. That's just how North Koreans are. But and if we just stop North Koreans from coming to China, we would stop these problems. But of course, it's not just how North Koreans are. Problems are caused by the fact that China doesn't have an open immigration policy. If North Koreans could not be deported back to North Korea, then a lot of these problems would be solved. There'd be more transparency, and people could not get away with violating the rights of North Koreans in China. North Koreans could, if you violate the rights of North Koreans in China, North Koreans could go to the police. And to me, this sounds so applicable to what is going on with Mexicans in the border states, where all these crimes are happening. These Mexicans are being exploited, violence is happening against them, and they're reluctant to go to the police because they're scared that going to the police that increases the likelihood of them being deported. And yet people are assuming this is just how Mexicans are. And if we just stop Mexicans from coming to the USA, we'd solve all these problems. As if laws against prostitution stop the exploitation of prostitutes. As if laws against drugs stop all the problems with drugs. When in fact, it's all these governmental restrictions, all this red tape that is causing the problems. So reading Yeonmi Park's book, In Order to Live, and reading what she wrote about how North Koreans are treated in China has a lot of lessons for U.S. policy in regard to people coming over from Mexico without a visa. And no, people don't come from poor countries into rich countries to exploit you. This is not a zero-sum game. They are trying to live. They're trying to live. That's a zero-sum game only insofar as politicians use the welfare state to make it a zero-sum game. And if you resent how you have to compete against immigrants for some tax loot, for some welfare, maybe instead of blaming the immigrants, you should blame the politicians who imposed that system on you in the first place. As for me, I say, if immigrants are in poor countries, they're in kleptocracies, and they want more freedom in the USA, they're not going to wait for your permission to come to the USA to seek out peace of their life peaceably. And that's a good thing. I don't resent that. I applaud that. Thank you very much.